everybody. I'm Dr. Rachel Burks. I'm the coordinator of SciPop Talks. Thanks for coming. Our first talk of the season to be kicked off by the Shadow Side of Play by Dr. Massanari, School of Communications. I hope you'll join us also the rest of the season. We've got crypto scams coming up next. And after that, right in time for Halloween, we are going to have kind of biology of monsters. And we are going to close out the season with physics of D&D. So if any of our continuing the gamers theme, but more in the tabletop realm, or if you're just a Stranger Things fan, you know little to nothing about D&D, you can come on out for that one as well. Right? So let me introduce my colleague, Dr. Massanari, so we can learn about the shadow side of play.
Thank you. Thanks so much. Hello, thank you all for coming out tonight. I am Adrienne Massanari. I'm in the School of Communication. So today I'm going to give a talk that's probably a little bit of a bummer. I don't mean it for it to be a bummer, but that's just kind of the work that I've been doing recently. But I do want to preface this by saying, first of all, I love games and play, and so I'm saying this out of a space of love rather than hate. And although I do think we have seen recently some rather toxic elements in games and gaming communities and gaming fandom kind of shape the discourse in particular ways. So generally, my work kind of talks about the relationship between design and platforms, and I'm interested in how communities develop, coalesce, and a lot of the work that I've been doing has been about the platform Reddit, if you are familiar with it. And tonight, I want to talk a little bit about an event called Gamergate from 2014. So what was Gamergate and why are we still talking about it? Because we are, or at least I am, sort of in this talk. Sort of what tactics did Gamergaters use to game social media? And I think this is important because gets us to where we are in this moment. 10 years later, we're seeing a lot of the same things happen online. Sort of how did this idea about Gamergate, a lot of it was predicated on this idea of ethics in games journalism. How did that draw the attention of political operatives on the right, particularly Steve Bannon? And what can we learn from this sort of entire mess? And what kinds of things, kind of lessons can we have for the future? So a lot of this talk is coming from my forthcoming book. It's out October 15th from MIT. So in the book, generally, I talk about the culture and politics of Silicon Valley and the ways in which I think that implicitly has laid the groundwork and foundation for mainstreaming a lot of the far-right messaging that we're seeing, and we're seeing this, obviously, on a day-to-day basis right now. But obviously, this has very real consequences for all of us. But I think it's been pretty obvious that big tech hasn't really kind of owned up to their own responsibility in this mess. Yeah. All right, so I want to start with a story. This happened, information just leaked about, September 5th. The Department of Justice noted that propaganda was being aimed directly at various communities online. And one particular community that I, of course, perked my interest was gamers. And so this report was called the Good Old USA report, and they were trying to swing the election. And we know that Russian disinformation and state actor disinformation is really popular. Right now is a very popular subject for us to be talking about, but it is also kind of confusing about how that's actually happening. And I think that it would be, anyone else who's like looking at this might be like, I'm not sure why gamers themselves would be the ones targeted with this kind of disinformation campaign. To go back to this, I think we should talk about a couple of things before getting to Gamergate. So when we think about social media, probably most of us are on some form of social media platforms. There's, sort of usual kinds of things that we do on those platforms. We share, we like, we retweet, we retweet. I don't know if it's called retweeting now, that Twitter is not Twitter anymore. So whatever we do, we share content. We're usually public. We're acting, we like and share and repost. That's usually what we think of as sort of the mainstream web or mainstream social media. There's also another kind of aspect to the web, which is what I call in my book the alternative web. And the reason I'm talking about this is because a lot of what sort of happened and precipitated in Gamergate came about because it rose from this place of the alternative web. So there's a certain set of affordances, so designed affordances that happen in the mainstream web that includes like visibility and publicness. So we're findable, we're assumed to be in public, we're assumed that more communication is always better. And this also creates a sense of our like, our sort of unified self. But the alternative web often presents a different set of kind of sort of affordances and sort of a different ethos, a way of being online. So the alternative web, and by this I mean if you want to think of actual websites, this would be everything from 4chan, some parts of Reddit, some parts of Discord, some parts of gaming communities, some parts of what we call the deep and dark web. But essentially that these places often sort of prize different forms of anonymity. So you see things like more pseudo-anonymity, like we see on Reddit. So people have a username and it's persistent, but like you don't necessarily know what person's quote unquote real name is. There's often what's called an internet ugly aesthetic. If you've been on 4chan or 8chan, I don't know why you would be, but if you have, or even if you go on Reddit, Reddit relatively recently had a redesign to make it a little bit more welcoming to outsiders, but oftentimes if we think about like classic internet memes, they're pretty stripped down, they're really sort of part of this, kind of quick, fast-paced things created in Microsoft Paint or whatever. And Douglas talks about that as internet ugly. There's sort of this idea that these are niche places. There's like a subcultures going on. This is where people are talking about their love of a particular game or fandom communities. Usually this is like places that are curated by people rather than algorithms, not exclusively. But this is really different than what we might think of as the sort of mainstream web, which is very algorithmically determined. It's sort of like your feed is really being determined by the companies themselves and a lot of questionable inputs going into it that are displaying things to you. And it's slightly less commercial. If you've been on Craigslist, for example, you can look at Craigslist as a great example of like what the internet, I just showed this to my class actually, what the internet used to sort of be like in the 90s. If you hear your old professors talking about the old web and the days of GeoCities and spaces like Craigslist. Yeah, Craigslist is a really stripped down, like very basic website that's much more about information sharing rather than influencers, right? So it's a very different thing. There's also oftentimes with the alternative web, we see more of like this sort of free speech absolutism. If you spend time in places like in some of these corners of the web, although Reddit is slowly changing this, but places like 4chan, 8chan, I mean, you see a lot of really objectionable speech and a lot of people saying a lot of really crass things. But the sort of ethos of the owners who own these spaces is usually towards allowing that speech. And privacy is sort of prized. Right? And that's sort of, I put in quotes, sort of in parentheses. And there's also, I think importantly, sort of this niche interest instead of influencers, right? So we're not seeing like, as much of the discussion being like, for example, on TikTok, you have niche interests, but they also then might lead to a big influencer, a set of influencers who gain a lot of social capital and then are able to kind of influence the network. The alternative web is a little bit different. People are organized around perhaps, again, like their love of a particular game. So it's within that space and out of that space that I want to talk about what was actually Gamergate. So this was a 2014 event. So in some ways, Gamergate represents this moment where the alternative web becomes mainstream. And so a lot of the places, a lot of the things that I'm going to be talking about tonight may seem like sort of old hat and sort of like, oh, this is just what it's like to be online now. Well, prior to 2014, I would argue there's been some significant changes in how we experience these online spaces. So in 2014, there was there's a space called Something Awful, which is a series of web forums. It's part of that alternative web space. If you've ever heard of like All Your Base Belong to Us, like a bunch of memes have come out of Something Awful. It's sort of like a pair to 4chan. So there was a thread about cringeworthy breakups. This person posted his story about a really terrible breakup event he had with his partner, his romantic partner. And there was a lot of stuff in this posting that was pretty awful. He sort of made the point that this person, Zoe Quinn, which he created an entire blog post about this person and dropped everything from like, you know, supposed like screenshots of their Facebook messages and all this stuff. And it's very long and pretty awful. But he basically claimed that Zoe Quinn, who was an indie game developer, had not only cheated on him, but had also basically traded romantic favors for good reviews of their video game, of Quinn's video game. So there was some concern. So this, of course, ignited a firestorm, both on Something Awful. It was quickly kicked off of there, but went to 4chan. So within the span of about a week, Quinn and a bunch of other people were getting repeatedly doxxed. They were experiencing death and rape threats and a lot of other really terrible things. In part because 4chan has always had this sort of geeky, and somewhat misogynist kind of feeling to it. And so a lot of the discussion, which was happening publicly, which started kind of carrying out to places like Twitter and drew the attention of people like Milo Yiannopoulos and Steve who was working as Steve Bannon's tech editor at the time for Breitbart, and Adam Baldwin, not that Adam Baldwin, but the other Adam Baldwin from Firefly, who actually coined the term Gamergate. They were sort of kind of making this argument that this was another example of failed sort of ethics in games journalism or in ethics in journalism. And that was sort of how they kept talking about this publicly. Privately, what was happening, though, was this massive harassment campaign. And I want to say also, to just be clear, obviously harassment within game communities is not new. There's been a lot of examples of this over the years, but what is new about this particular event was that this was sort of the most open, out in the open kind of public harassment campaign. So it both encouraged other people to join in, but then it also, in other work I talk a little bit about this, how it sort of served as a warning for people who wanted to speak out against what was happening, that they might be targeted next, right? So there was this sort of weird thing that was happening. And I will say that this extended out to literally anyone using the hashtag Gamergate to kind of say, hey, this is not cool, would immediately have their mentions flooded with people saying, well, you know, why isn't it, blah, 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 you know, like all of the things, and then potentially being harassed in various ways. So essentially what happened is, as this is moving from 4chan, so we had Something Awful starts out, then it gets kicked off there. Eventually it gets kicked off of 4chan, which is kind of amazing to be able to do. 4chan's random board, this is where it was posted to. Actually, Christopher Moot Poole, who started 4chan, essentially says later on that this is one of the reasons he left the helm of 4chan, was because of all of this stuff going around Gamergate. And then it moved to Reddit. And there's actually still a subreddit dedicated to Gamergate. You could go look at it if you want to. I mean, I would not necessarily, but you can. It's called Kotaku in Action. It still exists. And what's interesting is that as this sort of progressed moved from the alternative web to more mainstream spaces like Reddit, and then eventually towards the mainstream, like, you know, journalistic outlets started talking about this issue, it kind of gained this veneer of legitimacy, right? So no longer was this affiliated with just like the denizens of 4chan, which is classically, if you know, stereotypically, like if you remember in South Park, there's a very old South Park episode of Gaming episode where people are like in their basements. That's like the stereotype of 4chan. We don't really know that much actually about people using 4chan because it's anonymous. But there was sort of like this suggestion that that was a subcultural space that no one really understood, and now it was moving into sort of mainstream spaces. There was also a couple of other events that happened, and these are sort of alluded to in here. There were academics who were game studies people like me, who actually were part of an organization called DIGRA, which is the Digital Games Organization. There was a an event that happened at one of the conferences, and a bunch of people who were in support of Gamergate started actually harassing a bunch of academics and saying that DIGRA itself was run by a feminist cabal of people and that they were trying to ruin games. Kotaku, which was one of the major players, along with Gawker, now RIP Gawker, those were some of the outlets that were viewed as being very, like, sort of doing social justice warrior type or woke gaming journalism, so that's part of the reason that they were targeted. Anita Sarkeesian, who had actually a few years prior to this released a series of videos called Tropes versus Women in Video Games, and had received a bunch of attacks before that, actually was at some points having to cancel talks because of bomb threats and all this other stuff. And then there was sort of all of this large scale sort of churn about this and conversation about it. I want to talk a little bit, and I don't want to belabor this point, but I think it's worth talking a little bit about some of the tactics that Gamergaters use, because this is where I think if we see this, which is the argument I'm sort of making here, you'll see as we continue, that what happened during Gamergate set the stage for and kind of became a playbook for a lot of what we're seeing in the far right right now in terms of how they're approaching things. I think it's worth kind of remembering that these tactics were not sort of commonplace and at the time, but they may be now or more so now. So one of the most common things, this is a comic book, this is a comic strip from Wondermark. I'll give you a second to read that if you're. So this was one of the first tactics that emerged, and this was called brigade. I mean, we could talk about this as brigading. It was also known as sea lioning because of this particular comic. The idea being that anybody who disagreed with Gamergate or used the hashtag, especially on Twitter, would immediately have all these people, sea lions, coming to their door and saying, well, actually, it's about games and journalism, ethics and games journalism, and that's what it's about, and that's what we're doing here. And any sort of harassment that's happening is bad actors or trolls or other people. It's not us. We're not the bad people here. On Reddit, though, there's also a lot of the brigading was happening on various subreddits that were dedicated to, so there's like a girls gamers subreddit, there's a bunch of sort of niche subreddits for different communities, and those perceived as being sort of social justice inclined were then getting brigaded with, you know, spam and pornography and a bunch of other stuff to basically clog up the moderator's queue. And all of this seems kind of, kind of wonky to be doing this, but it was basically a way of sort of making everyone's lives much more difficult and much more likely to want to be online at all, which I will say that a lot of people just exited because they were like, if they could leave social media, many people did. There's also there was also a lot of Twitter also used a lot of there was also a lot of new egg accounts. Do you remember when Twitter used to have, like, essentially when you started Twitter, again, this is like X is not like this anymore, but arguably it's the same stuff again. So, but at one point when you started a new account on Twitter, you'd have these eggs, and that would be the sort of like, you've just hatched and you were not following anybody or whatever. And one of the things that would happen is that there were people supporting Gamergate were making mass numbers of accounts to basically then kind of continually harass someone so that their main account wouldn't be actually banned from Twitter. There's a whole set of other things like that. There's also some other sort of competing hashtags that arose because of this event. One was called Not Your Shield, and that was by people who purported to be, you know, communities of color who were talking about, like, don't use me as the face of diversity in games, and, like, I'm actually pro Gamergate. And there's all this question about, like, were those sock puppet accounts? Were those people really expressing their viewpoints? It's very confusing. All you need to know is that this tactic hadn't really been used in this way in particular before Gamergate. There was also lots of doxing. And what happened was oftentimes people would come forward, you know, Anita Sarkeesian, Zoe Quinn, you know, Brianna Wu, these people would come forward and say, hey, I've had all of my information released. I'm receiving threats daily. I've been working with the, you know, the authorities. And they would be then accused of doing sort of a false flag operation, that they were actually just saying that because they weren't actually being harassed, when in fact they would then show all of the documentation, and there would be this sort of ongoing debate about who's actually being harassed. No, you're not, you're just doing that for the attention. There was also, this is where a lot of the sort of information sharing was happening outside of the mainstream web. So a lot of this was occurring on places like Discord, where coordination was happening, and you can actually go, like, I think Zoe Quinn at one point released the logs of discussions that were about about them, and they're just about doxing them. And so you could see like how there was like this public and private face of things happening in the space. Doxing wasn't, not to say that it didn't ever exist before Gamergate, but certainly this is like one of the things that's popularized this as a tactic. There was also a lot of memetic warfare. The memes that I have here are clearly like anti-Gamergate memes, or sort of, kind of poking fun at the entire thing. But there were a lot of memes that were created by Gamergate supporters. A lot of them were harassing. Some of them were sort of like, there was a really vile game that had been created prior to all of this that got redistributed that was sort of like, sort of commit violence against Anita Sarkeesian. It was sort of a game meme. There was also, they also did a lot of what we know is like revenge porn, non-consensual pornography that was being released and shared around. All of this was sort of like released in some ways, I would say, to kind of just in general what Whitney Phillips and Ryan Miller talk about is polluting the information ecosystem, right? To fill it with so much trash that was going on, and also to kind of distance everything from what was really happening. So some of the memes were like somewhat clever, or they were trying to play on these things, but then it was also a question of like, is this being serious? Is this not serious? If you know about the discussion about the OK hand signal being used by sort of those associated with the alt-right or far-right, and the ways in which that was picked up as either an indicator of your racist intent or not racist intent, it was always sort of this question mark of which is it. I mean, I think this is where we get into the sort of ambiguity of play, which sort of underlies all of this. And then there was also this thing which I called archival warfare, and this kind of goes back to the Digra event that I alluded to, but there was also all of this incredibly intense like conspiracy theories about like how secretly game companies were being, co-opted and colluded, and like there was a bunch of academics, and particularly feminist academics, were actually at the helm of all these gaming companies, making the content more diverse and whatever else. I want to highlight the fact that as you see this, and you've probably heard me allude to, but I want to say it directly, the argument being made was not just about ethics in games journalism, right? So the argument very quickly went from that still being the public face of Gamergate, but what it actually became about was diversity in games and diversity within gaming communities, and the changing nature of sort of people's fans' relationship to these things that they loved. There's also, and I wanted to mention too, so just to remind you, because we're going to come back to that point in a second, one of the things I think was also pretty interesting and sort of shows the limitations of a lot of the guardrails that we have on social media were things like, so a bunch of people realized that you could, if you were, for example, if you wanted to go and have all of Anita Sarkeesian's videos taken down from YouTube, you could flag them for copyright infringement. And YouTube's mechanism would immediately take them down because they would be flagged as violating copyright automatically before they would even get reviewed. And it would take some period of time before anybody would actually review to see whether or not that was true, but they were sort of going on the good faith of their users. You can imagine if that is one of your core ways of making money, then demonetizing videos became like this very weird way that sort of this warfare was happening between, that primarily Gamergate was going after people in various ways. Again, just demonstrating sort of their technical prowess, and in some ways, I think this sets the stage for why they were of interest to people like Steve Bannon. So yeah, let's talk for a second about this. This is a story that came forth. So let's fast forward to October 28th, 2022. So the Trump presidency has ended. but we've seen like increasing partisanship, we've seen political violence and the insurrection. So a man enters the home of then former Speaker Pelosi's house and actually attacks her husband, Paul Pelosi, with a hammer. You may have heard of the story. This is actually what he said during the trial about a year later, that he was directly sort of interested in Gamergate and became radicalized in part because of that, right? Because Gamergate led him to this sort of rabbit hole of other content. That's his words, not mine. So we know that Gamergate in many ways radicalized at least some supporters, right? I think it's fair to say that the reasons people were involved in Gamergate, it was varied. Not everybody was there harassing everybody else. Not everybody was there to, maybe some people felt actually earnest about the fact that that there was a cozy relationship between journalists and game publishers. Maybe they felt like they weren't being heard anymore. But there was very clearly a direct effort by people like Steve Bannon to utilize Gamergate as a flashpoint for changing political life in the US and globally. Take a quick drink. So if you're not familiar with Steve Bannon, he was the former editor of the far-right magazine newspaper Breitbart. He was also advisor to Trump's campaign in 2016. He was a special advisor to the president before he was kicked out of that position. And now he's a right-wing podcaster. You might have seen him as Bill Murray on SNL a few times, portrayed him. He also actually is a huge gamer. So he's apparently a big fan of World of Warcraft, among other games. He spent about 6 years as the vice chairman for internet gaming entertainment, so in the mid-2000s. In Hong Kong. So IGE was actually a big player in the virtual currency market. So he understood games, he understood gaming fandom, he understood the communities that would coalesce there. And I think that's a kind of a somewhat untold story. It's mentioned in the biography about Bannon, but like that he actually had this idea to mobilize a lot of these Gamergate supporters into Trump supporters. But the larger question I have about this is like, why Gamergate though? Like, what is it about them really, in particularly, like what was the kind of play he was making for them? In the book, I talk about this as what he was actually tapping into was what I call identity nostalgia in the book. So in the book, I talk more extensively about this, but I'm just going to give a couple of points about this. So this kind of involves unspoken expectations of what we mean by when we say playing a game, and who we talk about who can play games or should be playing games. And so what actually Bannon did, which was fairly masterful in its Machiavellian way, was take this idea of that there's this thing that people are attached to, games and their identity as gamers, and transmits that and transforms that into, well, there's actually, what they're concerned about is this loss of their centrality within the gaming communities. And so we can mobilize that, we can like utilize that and turn that into essentially potentially votes for Trump or for far-right candidates. So I think, first of all, it's kind of worth us asking, so what is a game? So Gamergaters had unspoken expectations about what a game was and how playing it was supposed to make us feel. So one of the things that if you've played games, there's a subset of, there's games called AAA games, which are often referred to. So if you think about Hollywood studios, right, these would be like the games of Hollywood, right? These are the big budget, they have massive amounts of funding, they take a really long time to produce. They typically feature in sometimes very, and I want to preface this by saying, I love these games. These games are not bad, they're fun to play. There's lots of things about them that can be troubling, but also like there's a lot about them that are really artful too. But they often employ simple sort of good versus evil mechanics or kind of rely on this, if you think about like this sort of what's called the monomyth, so this idea that like the hero's journey or heroine's journey that Joseph Campbell talks about. So essentially you as a player become more successful and adept, your character becomes more successful and adept as a result. And it suggests kind of this linear path of growth, which is great. In game space, that's awesome, that's what we want. That's part of the times what we go to play games for. But if you think about the fact that if you are uncritically engaging in space, and I would say that, this is a much longer conversation we could have about like, do audiences, I'm not saying that they're passive at all. I think that people are active in their fandom of these spaces, but I think it's possible also in a steady diet of this without kind of really doing a little bit of critical self-reflection. It might be easy to see that that's how the world works, right? Is that there's this linear narrative that everybody can start with the same, from the same playing field, and then the players who are really good are going to be the top-rated, esports players, for example, in the world, and those who are just not, are just not. And that's all because everybody's got the same playing field. They all start from the same place. We probably know that there's, in the real world, I hate that term, but there's other sorts of barriers to entry sometimes. This also suggests that some games are like walking simulators. You might have heard that term. So this is actually Quinn's depression quest. This is a screenshot from that. It was a small, text-based indie game that simulated the experience of depression. One of the things I think is fascinating about this game is much of it is playing with the ideas of game mechanics. So there are things that you cannot do because your character is experiencing depression. It's supposed to be a simulation of what it is like to be perhaps knowing what you want to be doing and then also feeling like you can't do it for lots of reasons. So one of the things that often came up in Gamergate that I always found fascinating was that Quinn's depression quest, and they kept saying, it's not a game, it's just not a game, it's not even a game. And they would keep saying that refrain. And the thing is that sort of suggests a very limited mindset about what is a game, what is play, what is the purpose of these things that we do that we sometimes love and feel deep connection to. So Quinn was subverting these game mechanics by removing choices for the player. So they were either sort of saying, and in some ways that seemed so out of the realm of possibility for some of the Gamergate supporters who were like, it's not a game. It's like, well, that's actually really interesting. Like from a mechanics perspective, and as someone who enjoys games, I love that designers are thinking about the mechanics in this way. This is actually pretty complex. But it's also like there's no actual win condition in this game. As with actual depression, you sort of learn, depression quest suggests that you kind of learn ways of managing around this or like learning to integrate it in various ways. And it's not something that we overcome. It's something that we are, or become, or kind of maybe never sort of have an ending point to. So part of this is that, I think for a lot of the, people within the fold of Gamergate, for at least some of them, Depression Quest was sort of a question mark in their mind, not just because Zoe Quinn created it. Of course, that was one of the reasons they didn't like it, but also because it challenged their belief that games were supposed to be fun, right? So fun meant that a game could be challenging in terms of its difficulty, so you like grind, but it didn't mean challenging one's perspective and thinking sort of like looking up through the window through someone else's experience with something serious like mental health. Or even playful, like in other cases. It was also like radically different aesthetically than any sort of AAA game. This is a small indie game that's mostly a text-based game. Then there's also another thing that happened, which was like if games themselves were contested, like gamers, the idea of a gamer identity was even more so. And I will say the term gamer is very loaded. There's a lot of people who have talked about it. We don't really refer to other fans communities in quite the same way. Like if you're a movie buff, we say you're a movie buff. We don't call you a movieer or a filmer or something like that. So I always think that's weird. But there's also one of the things that happened during this, and this cracks me up. So this is WikiHow's. Like if you go and want to see if you type in how to be a gamer, like the WikiHow article is hilarious. So one of the things they have on the WikiHow article, even on the WikiHow article, okay, so we have perhaps a non-stereotypical gamer, because what has happened since 2014, I would argue, is that like we're having more discourse about the fact that everybody plays games, that, you know, people in marginalized communities have always played games. LGBTQ people have always played games. You know, BIPOC people have always played games. That's always been the reality. It's just now becoming more visible, and so things are shifting. I do think it's hilarious that this article in WikiHow sort of gives this very normative idea that true gamers do not play on easy mode. That right there is sort of the problem, right? So one of the things that happened during Gamergate, and everybody was in a frenzy about it, was Lee Alexander, who's a black woman, games journalist, wrote for Gama Sutra. She had an article called Games Don't Need to Be Your Audience, Gamers Are Over. And basically she was making this, I think, really nuanced argument about the fact that the games industry very often focused on this, what they call the core gaming demographic. So they're the people that are supposedly targeted for like Call of Duty, right? Like the primary targeted audiences for this. Or Grand Theft Auto or something like that. And it's not that other people didn't play games, but oftentimes game companies and AAA game companies in particular were really interested in getting that audience. And so she sort of said that that unfortunately creates this narrow definition of who gamers are. I mean, from my perspective, it's ridiculous because it also limits your audience unnecessarily. But we are also seeing, you probably have followed every other fandom community that has gone into disarray because someone of color has been in a particular role, or someone they've casted someone who wasn't who they thought should be in something or whatever. But it also implicitly encourages gamers or people who play games to feel like either anyone else who plays games are interlopers, right? And so this goes back to, there's a lot of really great work Kashana Gray has done about, in particular, Black Twitch streamers and the ways in which they're often viewed as deviant within these game spaces. And that's even still after years and years of playing games and of being in public spaces, that they're somehow seen as not participating in the right way. And I think there's this sort of gatekeeping sort of thing that happened with this that's really unfortunate, right? Because instead of games, I mean, ideally fan communities and fandom communities should be these like welcoming, reveling in something we all have connected, we all love. And instead of what happened was it became this very like policing about who was appropriately embedded in these communities and not. So we're almost done here, but I just want to say, so one of the things is I think that we can think about identity and nostalgia. So this nostalgia for this like identity was actually an example of what Arlie Russell Hochschild calls a deep story. So she sort of talks about this as a deep story as a feels as if story. It has the story is embedded in these sort of feelings we have about the truth of the world. And it creates this, what she terms a subjective prism for seeing the world. So in Gamergate, sort of their deep story revolved around the idea of being the target audience for these AAA games and for other cultural products, I would argue too, right? So yeah, other people could play games, but the presumption was, I mean, embedded in this was that mostly this was the realm of cishet white dudes who were like enthusiasts, who would be quote unquote hardcore players. And the kinds of games that they would be playing would not be Depression Quest or any sort of casual game, like Candy Crush or something on your phone. It would be like intensive, hardware intensive on a PC or the latest console, and you're playing it online and you're trash talking your teammates, and that was appropriate gameplay. And I think it's I think it's important to note that for all of us, probably pop cultural products are increasingly how we make sense of our identities in the world, for good or for ill. That's kind of an issue. But what happened was, I think that some of these fans saw their displacement from this as being a deeply personal affront, right? This was about sort of like the larger ways in which, at the time it was called social justice warrior, but wokeism or DEI or whatever, social justice words that you want to put in there, that they were somehow being unfairly undoing this idea of meritocracy, of their centrality within this space, and in society largely, right? So then as this kind of transforms, this becomes not just about ethics and games journalism as if it ever was, but like in the sort of figure of Bannon, it becomes about a referendum of displacement in much larger terms, right? And if you've been following the far right and a lot of their discussion and awful rhetoric around, for example, immigrants, is exactly about that. It is displacement of their centrality and the worry about sort of these very sort of, I guess Christian fascist, sort of understandings of this nuclear family and this nostalgia for something that never really existed to begin with, but it's sort of like they're suggesting that that's how the world should be. And you can see, I would argue, some of those roots in Gamergate. The other piece of this is Bannon also saw the sort of technologically proficient nature of Gamergate as being really important. So the fact, you might have heard the adage, like the left can't meme, that all arose around the same time as this Gamergate was happening. And sort of the suggestion was that Trump's campaign mobilized a lot of those people and then put them to work, is sort of pumping out different kinds of material. And then, and then of course, we also know in the backdrop of all of this is, of course, now we're in sort of even more chaotic media sphere where, like I mentioned earlier, disinformation and misinformation is going around and swirling around. So it's very hard to know, trace the lineage of any particular piece of information we're getting. And I do want to say that this is, we are in a really great space because now we are having more diverse games and we're having conversations like this. But I think in some ways this backlash was a reaction to shifts that are, I would say, largely positive in, in thinking about fandom communities and thinking about games and thinking about who plays and what kinds of games we can play. But obviously that those backlash moments also are pretty painful. Okay, so what kinds of things can we learn from Gamergate? I think that there's some obvious things. I mean, fandom communities can be really toxic. And we see this a million times over. If you followed any of the subsequent gates, there was like Comicsgate, there was Ghostbustersgate, like all of these campaigns that sort of are about the same thing. But then if you even go into like low-level Tumblr wars or Archive of Our Own or whatever, like toxicity is not limited to just like the right, or I mean, it's not always just partisan split or whatever. It's also that fandom communities can be, in the ways in which they bind themselves through their love of whatever they're doing, can also create their sort of own undoing in that, because people can get pretty gatekeepy about it. It also, I think, shifted us to remind us that the mainstream media sphere is now being influenced by these niche spaces. And so now we're seeing the sort of fruits of that, which is like these very siloed experiences that we have online that are curated in lots of ways by, sort of algorithms and the, attention economies that are happening, and the way Gamergate sort of manipulated that in particular ways, but also that, this was designed into these systems by Silicon Valley, which is another talk, that fandom has become politics and politics has become fandom. I have another chapter in my book about the Donald Trump subreddit, in particular talking about the ways in which sort of what's called dark play or shadow play is used to kind of create this ambiguity. We know that this is really interesting. Fandom hasn't actually had that kind of direct link to politics before that I know of in that particular way. There's also this move from conspiracy theory to conspiracism. So this is the idea that, saying ethics in games journalism, like what's the theory there? Like there's not much of a theory. It's just like a bunch of words being mashed together, and then for what purpose? So there's this is something that Muirhead and Rosenblum have talked about in particular relationship to Trump. So we saw this week, sort of discussions about like immigrants eating pets, and it's like, what's the theory? Like what is the end game of this? This is just repetition of phrases, and in some ways to make them come true. Doesn't really have much theory. And the fact that visibility and algorithmic economies are easily weaponized. And I would say that this is primarily because this is how they've been designed, right? And this is the larger argument is like, we have a problem here. that Silicon Valley has also its own set of values, and that part of the reason Gamergate was able to kind of flourish in the information ecosystem it did was because certain assumptions were being made by designers in Silicon Valley and developers about who their audiences were and what they should be doing in those spaces, and also, of course, sort of the advertising as a model for that. And I just want to mention, too, there was one little piece of this. There was a return of the Gamergate. So this was Gamergate 2.0. This was in March, so about 10 years later, another sort of little tiny blip on this happened, and Gamergate started trending again. And this was because a company called Sweet Baby, which is basically a writer's room for hire, that works with game companies to refine their scripts, often do things like, oh, okay, cool, you have this character, so like why, to sort of ask, to sort of suggest or prompt the idea of like creating more diversity within these communities. They say that they are interested in making empathetic stories while diversifying and enriching the games industry. Of course, they received a bunch of threats and all kinds of stuff happened. So I think with that, I'm gonna leave it there. Thanks so much for your attention, and I would love any questions you might have. So thank you. You can imagine a little baby hippo slide right now. That's so we don't have to like.
Questions?
Or there's food. Yeah. Oh yeah, there's.
Do you think that like the narrative, sorry, I guess I shouldn't say narrative, but I'm trying to think of the words, like, I can't figure out exactly what I'm trying to say.
Okay.
But, do you think that kind of like the grievances and the way that gamers expressed those grievances, do you think that like Steve Bannon was able to like ideologically link those to like the great replacement theory?
It's a good question. I mean, I think he kind of understood, like implicitly. Like I don't know if he was like as direct, but I mean he had spent a lot of time in that space, and I think that fit. I mean, he saw how it could be capitalized upon and certainly exploited. And that's not to say, again, I always feel it's important to say this, like this is not to say that every single person who was part of Gamergate like immediately became a Trump supporter or whatever, or was like understood that or were happy with what happened with all of that. But like, I would say that Bannon understood that he could use that anger about games as a proxy for anger about society, and that in the form of Trump was a good way to like mobilize people, and especially because those people could be then basically set onto Reddit and 4chan and a bunch of other places and create memes and do all this stuff, and they were very prolific in that regard. I don't know if he would acknowledge that, but I mean, that's my read of it. Yeah.
Would you consider some of the rhetoric being used by Gamergate and some of their adjacent followers and other associates to be somewhat hypocritical?
So can you explain more what you mean by that?
Basically, I know there's a lot of rhetoric from like Gamergate and a lot of like people who act like those kinds of people do tend to like a lot of their rhetoric goes against about like forced diversity and women. It does tend to be a bit more like anti-political, and like they're trying to put like all the politics in games and that kind of stuff. Yet at the same time, they are also somewhat political, considering that some of their political beliefs themselves and what they're trying to influence.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a great point and something I forgot to mention. Thank you for that. So, right. So a lot of the critique was that games should be apolitical, right? And if you, I mean, I'm of the personal, like a little P politics, personal belief that there is no apolitic. I mean, everything is a stance. Like we all have political stuff embedded. We all have a perspective. And if you want to equate that to political, you can. that games would be really boring and if people didn't tell stories, and stories always have, you know, sort of certain elements to them and certain ways of engaging with the world and reflect certain viewpoints. I do think it's interesting. I think you're right that there was a sense that you know, and we see this with all kinds of things, like Marvel Cinematic Universe, great example too, right? People saying that like Marvel isn't political and then get mad about certain things don't really understand anything, as Dr. Burke's like laughing over there. Like that doesn't exist. That's not a thing. I mean, you may agree with the political viewpoint or the perspective that's being offered, but that doesn't mean it's apolitical, right? And so I think that tension is, I mean, art makes us feel things, I would argue. Good art does in lots of different ways. And in part, challenging art is good for that reason. And it doesn't mean that everything has to be for your taste at all times. But I do think that there is, that's kind of a disingenuous argument to be making. Because because for people, like, yeah, why is it that, you know, if playing certain games is like you didn't see yourself on screen in a really fulsome way in certain characters, like if you've been playing games all your life, then do you see it as a place that you're welcome in, right? And some people wouldn't see it that way because they don't feel welcome in those spaces, in part because games didn't feature characters who represent their life experience.
It's pretty wild to say that Call of Duty and GTA are not political.
Right. Right. I mean, right.
That game in your life.
Yeah, right. I mean, I agree, you know, and again, I think that, you know, part of this goes, and I talk in my pop culture class, at least it was in that, been in that, like, I think we should not necessarily have guilty pleasures. I think you can play lots of games, and like, I've played Grand Theft Auto, it's a lot of fun. Is it horribly racist and misogynist? Yes, at moments, it is absolutely. There is nothing of value on some level, but it's also fun, right? So like we can do that. I think it's more about being critical about what that is. And you know, if you've been following the newest GTA stuff, like there's a lot of discussion about the fact that they're going to feature a woman in the primary role, and like what does that mean for this series that has always been about a particular understanding of masculinity, I guess. And a Latina, I think, too, also. So it's like there's sort of like, you know, I mean, I don't think that apolitical art exists.
Yeah.
I just wanted to ask for, like, where exactly you think this sort of attitude comes from. Because there's definitely the designs of certain games, but you also mentioned that there were people coming in from, like Russia is trying to influence gamers nowadays. As well as like possible political bad actors. So I'm wondering if you think it's the games themselves that are spreading the message, people coming in and trying to make certain talking points, or do you think it's just that what people are attracted to sorts of games?
I mean, all of those things are potentially happening. I mean, I think that it's like obviously game companies there's been a large discussion about the fact that game companies are still relatively not particularly diverse in sort of who is working for game companies. That's slowly changing. And this is in terms of AAA companies. Indie companies are much more, you know, sort of diverse. But also like this, Adrienne Shaw talks about this idea that we don't just like add diversity and stir and then just expect that the world is fixed, right? Like that's also the problem, is like there's a lot of structural reasons that games are made the way they are. They involve a lot of crunch time and a lot of other things that tend to kind of filter out and make them sort of unwelcoming in work environments for a lot of people. I would say so game companies themselves bear some responsibility in all this, which I didn't really talk a lot, but I also think that the communities themselves that coalesce around these games and normalize certain things, like if you've been in GTA Online, or if you play fighting games or whatever, like there's a very particular vernacular that even if you're playing with your couch friends, like you might get into an argument over that. And you can imagine you might have years of of friendliness with a person. And if you're playing Mario Kart, you might be at each other's throats. And you can imagine then what it's like if you're in a, you know, sort of lots of times in a somewhat pseudo-anonymous space where there's a little bit more freedom and people like are accustomed to trash talking and that's just normalized, that can easily kind of become its own echo chamber too. And then, yeah, on top of it, you have other political actors perhaps exploiting that too. So I don't think that's a great answer, but I think it's all of the things. If that's an answer for you. Yeah.
But then even when you talk about the politicalization of the game structure, you even have things that occurred as long ago, because I'm dating myself, as 35 years ago when the US Army created a video game specifically in order to recruit, long before drones and internet and everybody having cell phones. We're talking about a physical game they would send on disc to anybody that requested for free.
Yes.
As a recruiting tool, because it would get a name, an address, and an age group based on the game they sent out, and people would want extra levels, so they would interact with the recruiters, and it was a recruiting tool. So you have the gaming community being manipulated by external forces from the beginning, whenever there was games.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And by the way, if you're not familiar with this, I do think the military's investment in basically all entertainment products is fascinating and a sort of still undertold story. So, you know, on any movie, there's you know, if you want to use any military type of thing in your movie, there you will be, you know, the DoD will be part of consulting with you, and there's very clearly. Any sci-fi movie, for example, that uses like military-grade weaponry or whatever, or anything like that, there's very clearly a sense that if you want any of that, like if you were doing Top Gun, the newest Top Gun movie, that obviously the Department of Navy was very much invested in how they were being portrayed in that movie. And that's, you know, that's where you get into some weird, that's not necessarily, that cozy relationship is also maybe a little too cozy sometimes, right? It's like it also suggests that maybe some stories that would be more critical of particular institutions, like the military, aren't being told because they wouldn't have access, or certainly not being produced by Hollywood studios. Yeah. Did you have a question?
I did. So I know that places like 4chan and 8chan are not like necessarily hospitable to queer people, especially to people who are trans or non-binary. Do you think that Zoe Quinn's like being a non-binary person, do you think that contributed to their like status as the perfect target for harassment?
Yes, I do. I don't know if they were out as non-binary at the time. I think they were using she, her pronouns. I'm not sure what their status was. I do think that it 100%. I mean, like, yes, of course it did. Unfortunately, I mean, I think, and I think that there was a tension there because so much of obviously what sparked this was about Quinn. I mean, these are sort of old tropes that are used over and over again about, you know, the success of femmes in particular in spaces where, like, that you actually were not good at whatever it was that you did, or your game wasn't good. You actually just, you know, slept your way to the top, right? And sort of like that, those are very old and tired stereotypes. So I think that definitely, and I think especially probably, I'm not sure, like in the time period since then, if there's been a discussion about, I would hope Quinn is off the grid for the most part, but like, you know, about the fact that they're non-binary and sort of like what that also means for their, you know, sort of as looking back on this, what kinds of, you know, attacks were being made. I think it was heavily misogynist at the time, and I think that certainly there's a healthy dose of transphobia in there as well, too, on many levels, and that also, for lots of reasons, there were other people in that were caught up in that, too. So, did you have a question? Yeah.
Yeah, I'm curious, do you feel like there's any, I guess, correlation between this kind of thing and like single player versus multiplayer games? Because like on one of your slides I saw like on AAA games you had like Call of Duty versus Elden Ring, and in my mind those communities are two very different communities. Like, do you think that this is more prevalent in like multiplayer games, or do you think that this is still affecting communities of like single player games, or if it has any sort of correlation?
That's a good question. I don't really know the answer to that. I mean, I certainly think that multiplayer games, because they require multiple players, like at least in the ways in which, you know, if you're on Discord playing, like you're embedded in that space, that you might be more exposed to a lot of that. But I like even the like most friendly, like quote unquote casual game can get super toxic in their subreddits. I mean, that's part of, unfortunately, or if you're at cons, right? Like that's part of it too. Like, so I do think that there may be something there, but I wonder if it's more about like sort of all of the stuff around the games themselves rather than the actual sort of mechanics of the game, you know, whether or not it's solo or multiplayer, because I think that so much of our gaming experiences now are about what we call as researchers paratext, right? So the things around the games themselves, so the let's plays, the like, you know, strategy guides, the conversations on spaces like Reddit talking about stuff. And those very quickly can turn into, you know, trash fires. I mean, some of them are wonderful communities, but also they can be. I'm sure someone is probably trash talking Animal Crossing. I don't know, but I'm guessing it's probably happened.
It's happening on Discord.
Yeah. I'm sure someone's angry about something. So are we at time? I think
I
we're.
have one more question.
Yeah.
But again, we have wings. Is that
Yes.
in your book, do you talk about the parallels? Because when you talk about who's a true gamer, it really reminded me of when basketball was desegregated. And it's like, oh, well, the game is being played. It's not pure basketball. It was like so clearly, you're like, or like you saw it with the Williams sisters in tennis, Tiger Woods in golf. Do you try?
I don't, but that's a great connection, and it was sort of in the back of my mind. Yeah, that is, and like I said, there's other people who've done really good work on the sort of category of gamer and the way in which I sort of touch on that, but about like the presumption of who that includes and excludes. There's a really great book by Suzanne Scott called Fake Geek Girls too, which is specifically about the ways and roles of women and the ways in which sort of like you're not considered, I mean, and she's talking more about geek spaces, but this is true. I know of all of, you know, any friends that I have who are sports fans, like the amount of crap that they'll get from oftentimes like a dude who will be like, okay, so tell me all these stats or whatever. And it's just like this, like, and it's not, I can't do it without saying that voice that way. Cause it's just like, because it's like so presumptuous that like this sort of like, and it's oftentimes, I mean, and most often they know all of that, but it's also like the sort of performance of fandom, I think is fascinating, and sort of, and who is and is not in those spaces. And I think sports is those are great examples too of how that kind of works. So
another former speaker, if you're interested in that parallel, I think Dr. Teresa Rottweiler, she wrote a great book called Blackball. She was a speaker last year, talked about that with the NBA.
Yeah.
And how like, oh, it's not, you know, and you're seeing it right now with the WNBA, between particular players of like, oh, is that really gamesmanship? And you're like, it's basketball.
Right.
It is basketball.
Well, and also the fascination with someone like Caitlin Clark, suddenly it's like shows up, and it's like, well, are we now fascinated because it's a white woman playing in this space? And like, what's that about? So like legitimizing it in particular ways. So yeah, I don't think we can get out of that conversation about sort of like the unspoken assumptions about, you know, race and class and gender.
Really fascinating. Thanks
Thank
everybody
you.
for coming.
Thanks so much for coming.